She had never imagined her life would be reduced to sweeping brass casings off a cold concrete floor, but that was the rhythm she had fallen into. The shooting range smelled of gunpowder and oil, a sharp tang that clung to her clothes and hair no matter how many showers she took. Every day after classes let out, she walked straight here, pushed open the heavy steel door and slipped into her work gloves. Buckets of dented brass shells lay scattered around the firing stalls, waiting for her broom. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady, and steady meant survival in a world that rarely gave second chances. The range was alive with noise even in the evening, ear-splitting cracks of handguns, the thundering boom of rifles, and sometimes the delicate ping of .22 rounds hitting steel. She moved with practiced efficiency, sweeping casings into neat piles, stooping to scoop them into her container, then dumping them into the recycling barrel. Most people ignored her presence. They came for their hour of training, left their casings on the ground, and never once thought about the young woman cleaning up after them. She preferred it that way, the anonymity of her role allowing her to observe without being observed, to learn without ever asking questions. Her father had once told her that the world rarely noticed quiet people until they did something loud, and she held on to that thought, a seed she wasn't sure would ever grow. But on this particular night, there was someone watching her. She felt it before she saw him, the prickling sensation of eyes following her movements as she pushed the broom down the last lane. She glanced up briefly and caught the man's gaze. He was older, maybe late 30s or early 40s, with cropped hair peppered with gray and a bearing that radiated something she couldn't quite place. He wasn't just another weekend warrior unloading frustration into paper silhouettes. His posture was too precise, his grip too steady, his transitions between targets too smooth. Every shot he fired landed where it was meant to, a rhythm of control born not of practice alone but of necessity. She found herself slowing, watching him reload, watching him move. When he finally set his weapon down, cleared it, and turned toward her, there was a half-smile on his face, the kind that carried both amusement and challenge. "You've been watching," he said, his voice low but cutting through the muffled cacophony of the range. She hesitated, broom halfway through a sweep, heart suddenly thudding. "I was just cleaning," she replied, though her tone betrayed the fact that she had indeed been watching. "Cleaning?" he echoed, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Funny thing. You handle that broom like it's a rifle." Her lips parted, surprised. She wanted to laugh it off, to dismiss the notion, but there was no humor in his gaze. He had seen something in her posture, the way she crouched to gather brass with efficiency, the way her shoulders squared when she worked. It unnerved her, being read so easily by a stranger. "I don't know what you mean," she said, though the words tasted weak even as she spoke them. He stepped closer, not menacing, but with the steady weight of someone accustomed to commanding presence. "I mean," he said, "that you've either done this before or you're wishing you could. Which is it?" Her throat tightened. She had never told anyone at the range her secret, that while she swept brass for minimum wage, she spent her nights at home reading manuals she found online, watching videos of tactical drills, memorizing the stances and breathing techniques of shooters far better than herself. She couldn't afford ammunition, couldn't afford range time, but she studied like her life depended on it. Because maybe one day it would. Instead of answering, she bent to scoop another pile of casings. The man didn't press, but she could feel his eyes still on her. Finally, when she dumped the last scoop into the barrel, he spoke again. "Prove it," he said. She froze, broom handle gripped tight in her hands. The words rang louder than the gunfire echoing around them. Slowly she turned. "Prove what?" "That you're not just sweeping brass," he said evenly. "That you know what you've been pretending not to know. You've got the eyes of someone who wants this. So prove it." Her pulse pounded in her ears. She wasn't sure whether to laugh at the audacity of his request or to run from it. Who was he, anyway, to challenge her like that? But the steadiness in his voice, the confidence in his stance, told her he wasn't bluffing. He was a man used to measuring others, to seeing through facades. And something in her, that hidden seed her father once spoke of, stirred. She swallowed hard, her palms slick with sweat. For the first time, she met his gaze without flinching. "And if I can't?" she asked. His half-smile deepened, not cruel but certain. "Then you go back to sweeping brass. No shame in that. But if you can?" He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "Then you might just change the course of your life." Her heart skipped. She didn't know why, but she believed him. And for the first time in years, the thought of being quiet, of staying invisible, suddenly felt unbearable. The broom clattered softly against the concrete as she leaned it against the wall, her fingers trembling despite her attempt to appear calm. She had no weapon, no ammunition, no range card, just calloused hands and a heart hammering in her chest. The man's challenge hovered between them, absurd yet intoxicating. Nobody had ever looked at her that way before, not as a background fixture but as someone with potential. She felt her throat tighten as she tried to find the right words, but instead she found herself walking toward the front counter where the range master kept loaner gear. She wasn't sure what possessed her, pride, desperation, or the quiet fury of years spent ignored, but her feet moved with their own determination. The veteran, because by now she had guessed that was what he was, followed at a measured pace. He didn't push her, didn't add any more words. It was as though he knew the decision had already been made inside her. She signed the clipboard with a shaky hand, borrowed a pair of protective glasses, and accepted the range's worn earmuffs. When the attendant asked if she needed a rental pistol, she hesitated, but the man beside her spoke first. "Put her on the Glock 17, he said, his tone carrying an authority that brooked no argument. The attendant glanced between them, then shrugged and slid the case across the counter. She swallowed, clutching the weapon as though it were an artifact, heavy with meaning. It wasn't her first time holding a gun. Once or twice years ago, a friend had let her squeeze off a round or two at an outdoor gravel pit, but this was different. This was under scrutiny, under pressure. And in front of a man whose very presence suggested he would know instantly if she was faking. They stepped into an empty lane, the partition walls muffling but not silencing the concussive rhythm of others shooting nearby. She placed the case on the bench, flipped it open, and stared at the matte black pistol resting inside. It seemed to stare back, daring her to prove herself. Her fingers itched with the memory of diagrams she had studied online, the way she had traced the lines of firing pin assemblies and recoil springs late into the night while other people her age were out drinking or laughing with friends. She knew how this machine worked, even if her body had little chance to learn it. "Go ahead," the veteran said softly, standing just behind her right shoulder. "Show me." Her hands shook only slightly as she lifted the Glock, racked the slide to check the chamber, then slammed a magazine into place. She pulled the slide again, chambering the first round with a crisp motion. It wasn't perfect. Her grip trembled, her stance too narrow, but it wasn't the fumbling of a complete novice. She raised the weapon toward the target at the 7-yard mark. The paper silhouette stared back at her, its chest a faint gray outline against the bright background. She remembered every video she'd watched, every instruction she'd memorized. Firm grip, thumbs forward, knees soft, breathe, don't jerk. Her finger found the trigger, slow and steady, and she squeezed. The gun thundered, recoil slamming back into her arms, but she held it together, muzzle snapping back on target. The shot had punched low, near the silhouette's abdomen, but it was on paper. She fired again, adjusting her grip, her breathing. This time the round struck center mass, just below the chest line. A warmth spread through her chest, an affirmation that years of studying in secret weren't wasted after all. She fired again and again, finding a rhythm, each shot echoing her determination. By the time the magazine clicked empty, a cluster of holes marred the target's torso. Not perfect, not professional, but undeniably competent. Lowering the pistol, she turned slightly to glance at the man behind her. He didn't clap or cheer, didn't shower her with praise. Instead, he studied her with an intensity that felt almost heavier than the recoil had been. Finally, he nodded once, the faintest ghost of approval crossing his face. "You've been teaching yourself," he said. It wasn't a question. Her mouth went dry, but she nodded. "Videos. Manuals. I couldn't afford ammo. Or classes." He considered that, eyes narrowing as though weighing her confession against something only he knew. "You've got raw instinct," he said after a pause. "But instinct without refinement is a blade without an edge. It'll cut once, maybe twice, then break when it matters most." The words stung, but she knew they were true. She looked at the target again, at the ragged cluster of holes. For a moment, pride burned in her chest, but beneath it was the hunger for more, for precision, for mastery, for proof that she wasn't just another dreamer. She turned back to him, lifting her chin. "Then teach me," she said. The man's gaze hardened, though not unkindly. "Teaching takes time," he said. "Effort. Babe. Most people quit the first time it gets real. You sure you want that?" Her answer came without hesitation. "Yes." For the first time, his half-smile deepened into something genuine, though still edged with challenge. "All right," he said. "Then we start here now. Not with shooting. With listening." He reached over, tugged her stance wider, adjusted the tilt of her shoulders, corrected the angle of her wrists. Each movement was precise, practiced, almost surgical. "The gun doesn't care about your pride. It only obeys physics. Respect that and you'll get somewhere. Ignore it and it'll punish you. She breathed in his words, absorbing them like sunlight. For the first time, she wasn't alone with her obsession. Someone saw her, truly saw her. And though her arms ached from the recoil, though her nerves still trembled, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Sweeping brass had just ended, and her real training had begun. The following weeks blurred together into something both exhausting and exhilarating. Every evening after her shift ended, she no longer swept in silence and slipped out unnoticed. Instead, she found herself staying long after the other customers had packed up their gear, working under the watchful eye of the veteran. His name, she eventually learned, was Cole. He had served more than a decade in Special Forces, though he never spoke of it in detail. When she pressed, he simply said, "Enough to learn the difference between looking dangerous and being dangerous." The way he carried himself told her the rest. He didn't boast, he didn't need to. The scars on his forearms, the rigid discipline in his movements, the calmness in his voice when chaos erupted on the range, all of it whispered of battles fought in places she would never know. He had seen too much, survived too much, and returned with a quiet intensity that made people instinctively give him space. And yet, for reasons she couldn't quite understand, he had chosen to see something in her. Training with him was nothing like the slick tutorials she had memorized online. The internet had shown her clean, polished drills, shoot 2, reload, shoot 2 again, with smiling instructors making it look effortless. Cole's lessons were stripped raw, focused on fundamentals so simple they bordered on brutal. Grip, stance, breath, trigger control. Over and over until her muscles ached and her pride wore thin. He made her fire slow, agonizing strings of shots, not caring where they landed at first, only that her mechanics were correct. When she grew frustrated, when she demanded to go faster, to get good already, he cut her off with a curt shake of his head. "Speed is just sloppy fundamentals repeated quickly," he told her one night, his voice echoing in the half-empty range. "You want to be fast? Earn it by being perfect slow." So she did, though the process tested every ounce of her patience. Her hands blistered, her forearms trembled, her ears rang constantly from hours of gunfire despite the protective muffs. More than once, she slammed the pistol onto the bench, gritting her teeth as tears of frustration welled up. Each time, Cole only stood silently nearby, waiting. When she finally picked the weapon back up, he gave the faintest nod of approval, as though to say that persistence mattered more than talent. Outside the range, her life remained the same in appearance. Classes by day, work by evening, but inside, something fundamental had shifted. She walked differently now, shoulders squared, eyes sharper. She no longer drifted unseen past strangers, she assessed them, unconsciously noting posture, hands, potential threats. The world around her seemed less chaotic, more patterned, as if her mind had begun mapping possibilities she had never noticed before. One evening, after a particularly grueling session where he made her fire from awkward positions on her knees, she finally asked him the question that had been gnawing at her. "Why me?" Cole was silent for a long time, watching her clear the weapon and set it down with care. Finally he said, "Because you didn't flinch." She frowned. "The first time? My shots were all over the place." "Not your aim," he said. "Your eyes. Most people look away when they fail. You didn't. You kept watching, kept wanting more. That's rarer than you think." His words burned into her chest, both humbling and electrifying. She hadn't realized it herself, but she remembered the hunger she felt staring at those paper targets, the refusal to settle for mediocrity. She thought back to all those lonely nights reading and rereading the same training manuals, determined to memorize knowledge she couldn't practice. Maybe he was right. Maybe she had been waiting all this time for someone to finally push her into the fire. Cole pushed harder in the weeks that followed. He introduced movement drills, forcing her to fire while stepping sideways, backwards, even while crouching behind makeshift cover. Her body ached constantly, muscles screaming in protest, but each session left her sharper than before. The first time she cleared a malfunction instinctively, tap rack bang without even thinking, Cole's grin broke through his usual stoicism. "Now you're starting to look like a shooter," he said. The praise was minimal, but from him it felt monumental. Still, doubt lingered in her quieter moments. Who was she to think she could ever match the skills of someone like him? He had fought wars, lived in places where mistakes got people killed. She was just a broke student working a part-time job sweeping casings. The gulf between them felt insurmountable, and late at night, lying awake in her cramped apartment, she wondered if he saw her as a project destined to fail. But every time she returned, he was there, unwavering, offering his time and his knowledge without asking for anything in return. If he thought she was wasting his effort, he never said so. Instead, he pushed her harder, demanded more precision, corrected every sloppy angle until she wanted to scream. Yet beneath the gruff exterior she sensed a quiet respect growing between them, the unspoken acknowledgement that both of them needed this. She, the direction and discipline. He, the chance to shape someone who might carry forward what he had spent his life learning. One night, as they packed up the range, Cole finally gave her a piece of himself beyond instruction. He handed her a battered challenge coin, worn smooth from years of being carried. "We used to give these to people who proved themselves," he said, his voice low. "Not for being perfect. For refusing to quit." Her fingers curled around the coin, its weight anchoring her in ways she couldn't explain. She met his eyes, and for the first time she felt not like the girl sweeping brass, but like someone on the edge of becoming something more. The coin never left her pocket after that night. She carried it to class, to work, even when she lay in bed staring at the cracked ceiling. It wasn't just a token, it was proof that someone had seen her grit and deemed it worth recognition. Every time her fingers brushed the smooth, weathered surface, she felt steadier, less like an invisible girl cleaning up after others and more like a blade being sharpened with every cut. Cole had changed the way she measured herself. Grades, paychecks, approval from professors, all of it felt smaller now compared to the weight of every drill, every correction, every ounce of sweat that darkened her shirt at the range. She had been living half asleep before. Now she was awake, and waking up came with a hunger that startled her. But hunger didn't erase fear. Cole's training grew more punishing, not less, as the weeks passed. He added stress she hadn't imagined, making her fire while he barked commands in her ear, forcing her to reload under timed pressure, demanding she hit targets in specific sequences. One night he dropped a handful of brass casings onto the floor and told her to pick them up between every magazine change. "Because in the real world you'll never reload in silence with both hands free," he explained. The extra steps seemed pointless until she realized how much more complicated the process became with distractions. She fumbled, cursed, fought through it. Cole never softened. His praise was rare, measured in slight nods and short comments like "better" or "do it again." She burned with both frustration and determination, often walking home with her hands shaking from fatigue. But the strangest part was that she loved it. For the first time, her failures weren't wasted. They became fuel, obstacles to crush rather than walls to turn away from. Her old life of quiet observation felt distant now. She no longer just watched others live. She was fighting tooth and nail to carve out a place of her own. Yet questions haunted her. Why was Cole doing this? What did he see in her that made him invest hours of his time, ammunition, and energy? She couldn't imagine he trained every curious stranger who passed through the range. Sometimes, as they packed away weapons and cleaned the lanes long after closing, she wanted to ask outright. But every time she caught the shadow in his eyes, the shadow of memories he didn't share, she swallowed the question. Some truths weren't hers to demand. The turning point came late one Friday evening. The range was nearly empty, just a few distant cracks echoing down the hall. Cole had set up a drill that required her to fire, move, kneel, and fire again. She stumbled through the first two attempts, rounds scattering across the target with little grouping. Her chest heaved, sweat soaking her collar. She was about to protest that she was too tired when Cole suddenly stepped forward and yanked the target closer. He pointed at the wide scatter of holes, his expression sharp. "This," he said, "isn't about skill anymore. This is about you." She bristled. "I'm trying." "Trying doesn't matter under fire," he cut in, his voice like stone. "What matters is whether you finish the fight even when you're scared, tired, or broken. Right now you're giving me excuses, and excuses will get you dead." The words hit harder than the recoil of any pistol. She wanted to shout back, to throw the gun down and storm out, but deep inside she knew he was right. Her failures weren't because she lacked knowledge. They were because she hesitated, because she was still half clinging to the timid girl sweeping brass. The silence stretched, her hands trembling. Finally, she raised her chin and forced herself to meet his stare. "Again," she said. Cole's eyes narrowed, but something like approval flickered there. He reset the target, stepped back, and nodded. "Then show me." Her arms screamed as she lifted the pistol again. Every breath rasped in her throat, every motion weighed down by fatigue. But this time she didn't think about excuses. She thought about the coin in her pocket, about the years she had spent hiding in plain sight, about the chance standing in front of her now. She fired, moved, knelt, fired again. Her shots weren't perfect, but they grouped tighter, sharper. She forced herself through 3 magazines, each one a war against her own weakness. When the last casing clattered to the floor, she stood panting, chest burning, but her target bore the proof. A cluster in center mass, no wild strays. Cole studied the paper, then looked back at her. His lips twitched into the barest smile. Now that, he said, was you fighting. The flood of pride and exhaustion nearly broke her knees. She wanted to collapse, to cry, to laugh, but instead she only nodded, swallowing hard. Something had shifted, subtly but permanently. The girl who swept brass was gone. In her place stood someone who had proven, at least to herself, that she could endure. As they packed up for the night, Cole finally broke his own silence. I don't waste time, he said quietly, almost to himself. I saw too many people I cared about get buried. So when I see someone worth the effort, I make damn sure they don't end up the same. She froze, his words heavy with meaning. He didn't elaborate and she didn't press. But she carried them with her as she walked home beneath the glow of streetlights, the coin warm in her pocket, her body aching, her spirit blazing with a determination she had never known. Why now? Her life had split into two distinct worlds. In one she was still the anonymous young woman drifting through university lectures and scraping by with her part-time job, a shadow in the back rows, a face nobody remembered. In the other she was a student of fire and grit, forged under Cole's relentless guidance. The contrast felt surreal. By day she took notes on economics and history, by night she crouched behind cover, firing at targets while her mentor barked at her to move faster, think sharper, breathe steadier. The two halves of her life didn't feel like opposites anymore, they felt like the price and the reward. She endured the monotony of her old world so she could earn the fire of the new. Cole expanded her training beyond the firing line. He insisted that shooting was only one sliver of survival, the flashy part people glorified while ignoring the foundation. So he took her out behind the range into the uneven dirt lot where nobody watched. There he drilled her on situational awareness, making her describe every detail of their surroundings from memory after only a few seconds of observation. Details save lives, he said. You miss a car parked where it shouldn't be, you miss a shadow moving wrong and you're already behind. At first she failed miserably, struggling to remember half of what he asked, but soon her brain sharpened, her eyes scanning with purpose. She began noticing things in her daily life too, the way a stranger's hand lingered near a pocket, the unusual rhythm of footsteps behind her, even the shift in body language when two people argued softly across a cafe. The world had always been full of signals, she simply hadn't been trained to read them. Physical conditioning came next. Cole was merciless in this regard. He dragged her into workouts she thought impossible, forcing her through push-ups until her arms buckled, making her sprint across the gravel lot until her lungs seared. A fight won't wait for you to catch your breath, he reminded her, ignoring her protests. She had hated running her whole life, but under his gaze she pushed farther than she ever believed she could. At night her body screamed, muscles throbbing in agony, but she woke each morning stronger, leaner, sharper. And though she cursed him under her breath during every drill, part of her relished the transformation. She wasn't just training to shoot anymore, she was becoming someone resilient, someone dangerous in ways she hadn't thought possible. The breakthrough came unexpectedly during one of their outdoor sessions. Cole had set up a mock scenario using cardboard silhouettes tucked between barrels and old pallets. He gave her a simple directive: move through, identify threats, eliminate them. It was the closest thing to a simulation he'd allowed. Heart pounding, she entered the improvised course, weapon raised. She stumbled at first, her nerves threatening to unravel her, but muscle memory kicked in. She cleared corners, pieced together angles, fired controlled pairs into the targets. When she emerged at the far end, the acrid smell of spent rounds hanging in the evening air, every silhouette bore holes clustered center mass. Her chest heaved, her hands trembled, but a fierce thrill coursed through her veins. Cole approached slowly, surveying the field. His eyes lingered on each target, then finally met hers. That, he said simply, was clean. It was the closest thing to unqualified praise she had ever received from him. For a moment she felt like she might explode with pride, but she forced herself to swallow it, to remain steady. Still, when she slipped her hand into her pocket and felt the coin's cool edge, she knew she was standing on the far side of a threshold. Her confidence grew, though Cole made sure it never grew unchecked. Every time she thought she had mastered a skill, he shifted the bar higher. Blindfolded reloads. Shooting on the move in dim light. Exercises where he deliberately sabotaged her gear to see how she adapted under stress. He never allowed complacency, never let her believe for a second that she had arrived. And though part of her bristled at his unrelenting standards, another part was grateful. He wasn't coddling her into false security. He was preparing her for something real, something she couldn't yet name but felt looming on the horizon. One night, as they locked up after another brutal session, she finally asked what had been gnawing at her for weeks. "Why are you teaching me all this?" Cole paused, his hand on the heavy steel door. For a long moment he said nothing. The faint buzz of a flickering light filled the silence. Finally he spoke, his voice low. "Because someone once did the same for me. And because I swore I'd never waste it." She frowned, searching his face, but his eyes were distant, staring at something far beyond the range walls. "What happened to them?" she asked carefully. He shook his head once. "They didn't make it back." The words dropped between them like lead. She didn't press further. Some scars weren't meant to be unwrapped. But as they stepped out into the night, she understood that what he was giving her wasn't just training, it was legacy. He was passing forward the weight of everything he had survived, everything his brothers in arms hadn't. And she vowed silently that she would honor it, that she would not let his effort be wasted. Walking home, the coin pressed against her palm, she realized something else. This wasn't about sweeping brass anymore. It wasn't even about proving herself to Cole. It was about proving that she could become the kind of person who didn't flinch, who didn't fade into the background, who could carry forward the fire someone else had lit. Winter settled over the city, cold air biting her cheeks as she made her way to the range after class. By now it was less a job and more a second home. The sound of gunfire no longer startled her, the acrid smell of powder no longer clung like an annoyance. It felt like the scent of progress. Cole was waiting as always, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, posture relaxed but eyes sharp. He never greeted her with fanfare. Just a curt nod as though to say, "You're here. Good. Let's work." She respected that about him. He didn't coddle, didn't waste words. Everything he gave her was direct, practical, and brutally honest. This night was different. Instead of their usual drills, he tossed her a duffel bag and said, "Change." Inside was a set of worn tactical pants, boots, and a heavy jacket. The clothes were far too big, cinched at the waist with a belt, but she pulled them on anyway. When she stepped back out, Cole handed her a training rifle fitted with a blue barrel insert to mark it safe. "Tonight," he said, "we stop playing in lanes. Tonight we move." He led her into the back warehouse where the range stored old partitions, broken targets, and pallets stacked high with junk. He had rearranged the space into a crude maze, shadows stretching across uneven floors. "Real fights don't happen in straight lines," he explained. "You're not going to get perfect lighting, perfect footing, or a clear sight picture. Out there you'll be scared, confused, and one wrong step away from dead. Better you learn that here than when it counts." The first run humbled her instantly. She tripped on debris, tangled herself in her sling, and hesitated at corners. Cole barked corrections, his voice sharp as gunfire. "Keep your muzzle up. Check your six. You think the world's going to wait while you fumble? Move." She stumbled through, drenched in sweat despite the cold, lungs burning by the end. Her frustration boiled over. "I'm not ready for this," she snapped, ripping off the earmuffs. Cole didn't flinch. He just studied her, calm but firm. "You'll never feel ready. Readiness isn't a feeling, it's a decision. You decide to act anyway." The words lodged deep, and though she wanted to argue, she knew he was right. So she picked up the rifle, adjusted her sling, and ran the course again. This time her steps were steadier, her eyes sharper. Mistakes still piled up, but less with every attempt. By the end of the night, she was collapsing behind cover without hesitation, piecing corners properly, breathing through her shots instead of jerking them. She wasn't perfect, but she was moving with purpose. As weeks passed, Cole layered in more complexity, low-light drills, shooting with a flashlight, scenarios with hostages, represented by blank silhouettes she wasn't allowed to hit. She learned to process faster, her brain sparking with calculation under stress. Each success fed her hunger, but each failure cut deep, and Cole never sugar-coated them. "Miss a shot like that in the real world, and you're the reason someone doesn't make it home," he said after one poorly controlled run. The weight of those words pressed on her until she tightened every corner, every trigger squeeze, refusing to let carelessness define her. Still she wrestled with doubt. Some nights, walking home, she caught herself wondering if she was chasing a shadow. What future was she building? She wasn't in the military. She wasn't law enforcement. She was just a student with a broom and an obsession. Who was she kidding, thinking she could mold herself into something more? But then she remembered Cole's eyes the first night, the way he had seen through her silence and demanded she prove herself. He hadn't walked away then. And if he hadn't, she wouldn't either. Their bond deepened, though neither of them said it outright. Cole remained distant about his past, but now and then a detail slipped. A comment about operating in deserts, a scar traced absent-mindedly as he spoke, the way his gaze grew hard whenever helicopters thundered overhead. She didn't pry. She simply listened, storing every fragment like a puzzle she wasn't meant to solve. He, in turn, began trusting her with more responsibility. Sometimes he handed her the keys to open the range early for their sessions. Other times he let her critique her own performance, asking, "What did you see wrong? What would you fix?" It wasn't just instruction anymore. It was mentorship, a transfer of ownership. One night after another exhausting maze run, they sat against the wall sharing water from his canteen. The warehouse was silent, the city muffled beyond its thick walls. She glanced at him, finally voicing what had been on her mind. "Do you ever regret it? All of it?" He was quiet for a long time. When he answered, his voice was rough. "I regret the things I couldn't change. The ones I lost. But the fight itself? No. Regret comes from standing still when you should have moved." He looked at her then, eyes sharp even in the dim light. "Don't make that mistake." The words carved themselves into her. She nodded slowly, gripping the coin in her pocket. She understood now, this wasn't about becoming some perfect soldier or matching his past. It was about refusing to live half asleep, about never again sweeping through life without daring to step forward. That night, walking home beneath the streetlights, she realized Cole wasn't just training her to shoot, to move, to fight. He was training her to choose to live awake, unafraid, unwilling to fade into the background. And for the first time she believed she could. Spring thawed the city slowly, dripping water down cracked sidewalks and filling gutters with rushing melt. She had changed with the seasons too. When she looked at herself in the mirror now, she no longer saw the timid girl sweeping brass in silence. Her shoulders carried confidence, her stance held steadiness, and her eyes reflected a spark she hadn't known she had. Yet Cole wasn't done. If anything, he pressed harder, as though sensing she had reached a threshold and now needed to break through. One evening he pulled her aside after drills. "Tomorrow we're leaving the range," he said simply. She blinked, surprised. "Where?" He didn't answer directly, only said, "Pack light. Wear boots. And don't bring excuses." The cryptic nature unsettled her, but she obeyed. The next day he drove her far outside the city, through winding back roads until they reached a wooded expanse that seemed to stretch forever. Pines crowded the horizon, their scent sharp in the cool air. He killed the engine, grabbed 2 rucksacks from the trunk and tossed one to her. It was heavy, too heavy. "What's in this?" she asked, straining as she hoisted it onto her back. He smirked faintly. "What you need. Nothing more. You'll thank me later." The hike began at a brisk pace, Cole moving with the silent efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. She stumbled to match him, her breath frosting in the air. Hours passed, legs burning, shoulders aching beneath the straps. When she thought she would collapse, he called for a halt. They set camp by a small clearing, no fire, only cold rations. As darkness crept in, she shivered in her jacket, watching him scan the treeline with the same vigilance he always carried. She realized then that this wasn't just an exercise in endurance, it was a lesson in presence, in never letting your guard down even when exhaustion gnawed at your bones. At dawn the drills began. Cole used the forest as their classroom, pointing out how sound traveled differently between trees, how visibility shifted with shadows, how movement betrayed position. He had her crawl through underbrush, climb ridges with her pack, cross streams with soaked boots dragging her down. Every task seemed designed to break her spirit. More than once she wanted to quit, to hurl the pack at his feet and demand a ride back to the city. But each time she caught his expression, steady, unreadable, silently waiting for her decision. And each time she clenched her teeth and pushed forward. By the 3rd day she was raw but sharper. Her body hurt, but her awareness expanded. She noticed the crunch of twigs beneath her boots, the way her breath fogged in rhythm with her steps, the subtle snap of a branch that wasn't hers. She began to move quieter, quicker, thinking not just about her own actions but about the unseen threats around her. Cole noticed too. For the first time his voice softened slightly. "Good. You're starting to see." That night, as they sat in the cold clearing, she asked him why he was putting her through this. He studied her for a long moment before answering. "Because the world doesn't hand out easy fights. And because one day someone's going to need you strong. If you fold out here where it's safe, you'll fold when it matters." She absorbed his words, a mix of dread and determination tightening in her chest. She didn't know who that someone might be, but the thought that her strength could one day matter to another person burned away her fatigue like fuel. On the final morning, Cole gave her a test. He disappeared into the forest before sunrise, leaving behind only a note scrawled with 2 words, "Find me." Her heart hammered as she shouldered the pack and stepped into the trees. Every sound magnified, rustling leaves, bird calls, distant water. She moved cautiously, scanning for tracks, broken twigs, displaced earth. Hours passed, her focus narrowing into a sharp thread. When she finally spotted the faint outline of his boot print in mud, a surge of triumph carried her forward. She tracked him relentlessly, following signs most people would overlook. A bent sapling, faint scuff marks on stone, a disturbed patch of moss. At last, as afternoon waned, she saw him standing in a small glade, arms crossed. He hadn't moved far at all, he'd simply watched her work. When she approached, breath ragged, mud streaking her face, he nodded once. "You proved you can hunt." He didn't smile, but in his eyes flickered something close to pride. The hike back to the car felt lighter despite her exhaustion. She carried not just the pack but the weight of accomplishment. For the first time she truly believed she wasn't just training. She was transforming. When they reached the city again, Cole broke the silence as he parked. "What you did out there, most people quit long before finishing. Remember that. You've already gone further than most ever will." His words struck her harder than any reprimand ever had. 4 hours afterward, even as she collapsed into bed, those words replayed in her mind like a mantra. She realized then that what she had started as a challenge, a stubborn urge to prove herself to a gruff veteran, had become something deeper. She wasn't just sweeping brass anymore, wasn't just training under someone else's shadow. She was carving herself into someone who could endure, someone who could act, someone who could matter. And though Cole hadn't said it outright, she understood that the journey was far from over. This was only the beginning. Summer arrived in full heat, pressing down on the city streets and filling the air with dust and gasoline. Her training had become part of her life now, almost a second nature. Mornings began with long runs, afternoons with drills, evenings with lessons that tested not just her body but her will. She no longer flinched when Cole's voice cut sharp commands, no longer doubted when fatigue whispered for her to stop. Somewhere along the way she had stopped being the girl who swept brass and started being the woman who loaded her own magazines with steady hands. But Cole, ever the relentless teacher, had one last challenge. One evening, after another exhausting day, he told her, "Tomorrow night you'll prove it for real." The phrase sent a chill through her despite the heat. She wanted to ask what he meant, but something in his tone silenced her. Instead she nodded. The next night he drove her to a warehouse district on the edge of town. The streets were empty, shadows stretching long under flickering lamps. The building they entered was cavernous, abandoned except for crates stacked high and a series of dim floodlights that barely pushed back the dark. She followed, nerves tightening in her chest, until Cole stopped and turned. "This is it. Everything you've done leads to tonight." He handed her ear protection, then a loaded rifle. She stared at the weapon, heavier than any training tool she'd used before. Real rounds. Real weight. Cole walked a few steps back, his voice steady but hard. "You'll run this course blind. Targets are set up. Some move. Some don't. You'll clear the space step by step. No hesitation. No second guessing. When it's over, you'll know if you're ready." Her throat went dry. The silence of the warehouse pressed on her ears, making her pulse thunder louder. But then she remembered the nights on the range, the forest hunt, the endless hours of Cole's grueling drills. She had clawed her way through every test he'd given her, each one designed to strip her weakness bare. If she faltered now, it would mean every step forward was wasted. She steadied her breath, nodded, and stepped into the shadows. The first target swung from behind a crate. She dropped low, exhaled, fired once. Clean hit. The sound cracked through the empty warehouse, echoing like thunder, but she kept moving. Another target appeared, this one fast, darting across her path. She pivoted, feet balanced, squeezed the trigger again. The silhouette collapsed. Each step forward demanded awareness, precision, the discipline Cole had drilled into her until it felt instinctive. Minutes blurred. Sweat stung her eyes, her muscles ached, but she pressed on. At one point, 2 targets appeared at once from opposite sides. The old her would have panicked, chosen wrong, frozen. But now she shifted smoothly, firing left then right, trusting her body to follow what her mind had already calculated. She could almost hear Cole's voice, "Don't think too long. Trust the work you've done." When she reached the end of the course, her rifle clicked empty. The last target fell. Her chest heaved with effort, but her hands were steady, her stance solid. The warehouse rang with silence again. Then Cole stepped from the shadows, his expression unreadable. For a long moment he said nothing. She feared she had failed, that some unseen mistake would undo her effort. But finally he gave a single nod. "You've proved it." The words hit harder than she expected. A rush of relief, pride, and exhaustion nearly buckled her knees. She lowered the rifle, realizing tears burned at the edge of her eyes, not from weakness but from release. They left the warehouse in silence, the night air heavy with the scent of asphalt and summer heat. As they reached the car, Cole finally spoke again, his voice quieter than she had ever heard. "When I first saw you sweeping brass, I thought you'd break after the first hard push. But you didn't. You took every hit, every lesson, and you stood taller each time. That's rare. That's strength." He glanced at her, and for the first time she saw respect plain in his eyes. "Whatever comes next, you're ready?" She didn't know exactly what next meant. The world beyond their training was uncertain, filled with challenges she couldn't yet imagine. But she knew now that she carried the strength to face them. She had proved it, to him, to herself, to the doubts that once held her back. As dawn broke on the horizon during their drive back, painting the sky in streaks of gold, she leaned her head against the window and allowed herself a small smile. She had walked into this journey seeking only to prove herself to a hardened veteran. She had come out of it forged into something more, resilient, steady, unyielding. And though she didn't say it aloud, she knew deep down that she would never again be just the girl sweeping brass. She was someone who could endure, someone who could fight, someone who had learned from the hardest teacher that strength isn't given, it's earned step by step until the moment you finally prove it. The end.